It's, as always, a great pleasure and an honor to speak to this meeting of the Baha'i Studies Association, as indeed it is always to speak whenever I had the opportunity to any Baha'i group, because it is a group which I find extremely like-minded, with my conceptions, an extremely positive force in the world that one can only hope will grow and spread in the interest of world order, in the interest of unity. This morning I'd rather like to talk to you about the importance of ideas, the importance of culture in a broad sense, not as museums and concert halls only, but as what we all live and breathe, our perceptions. Of these factors in which religion has a primary focus and role, the importance of these factors in this movement toward a world order. And I would like to try to focus in on some key questions, key problems in this connection. First of all, just a word on the title of this conference, Convergent Realities. Human beings make their own reality. When we build a culture, a civilization, we create the reality around us. And indeed, these realities can be very divergent. For a world order, we need diversity, but we also need unity. So if we are going to bring these divergent realities into the framework of a world order, we also have to have convergence between these divergent realities. In that sense, convergent realities is true. But realities always has to be understood as the reality that is created by human beings when we talk about convergence. Because reality in itself, that is divinely created or in nature, or whether we hold a scientific, religious or other view, reality itself is single and we believe is unitary. It is not in itself convergent. Only our approaches to it are convergent. Only the realities that we create can converge. Reality itself is there. And it's our job, our task, I think, as human beings, among other things, to try to understand this reality. It has certainly been my lifetime, a lifelong occupation or preoccupation, to try to understand the world as consisting of a single organic unity. Of course, with tremendous diversity within it, but the element of unity which we have kind of lost in the last few hundred years in the search for specialization, in digging down here and digging over there, and organizing our systems of knowledge into academic compartments which don't really talk to each other, and etc., with their own languages. To find this unity, which has always been there in the great religions, which has been there in all the great mystical thought, mythical thinking also, which in the first flush of success of the modern age with technology, with specialized experimental science, we tend to have put on the back burner. I think it's time to recover some of this. And the recovery of this within the sciences comes at a very propitious moment, comes at a time when the recovery of this unity in nature becomes a precondition for the unity of mankind. And the unity of mankind is probably a precondition of the survival of mankind. So I think here science and religion joining forces, having to join forces in the search for the unified, integral world picture within which humanity has a meaningful role. With these few prefatory remarks, I'd like to sort of get on and do basically perhaps two things. First, say why, in my view, based on the analysis, assessment of the contemporary results of various sciences, why, in my view, we are indeed heading, unless we kill ourselves in the process, which is always possible, unfortunately, but we are heading in the long term, and perhaps within our generation or the next, toward a more integrated, more unified kind of a human, international, inter-regional, intercultural system toward a world order. In which the first point I'd like to make is that the idea of a world order is not poetry, is not based only on faith or on timeless intuition. It is something which is a prospect if you look at the direction of evolution in the human area, and perhaps if you integrate the human area, the human realm, into the general trend of development, of evolution in nature. So that we are not dealing with an arbitrary concept. Even if it's a concept comes by divine revelation, it is also, and at the same time, I think, demonstrable that this concept of a more unified, more integrated human system is one that emerges to us from a study of the patterns of evolution in nature and in history. I think this is very important because here are those two elements, I think, that in the Baha'i faith have always been emphasized, the two wings on which this faith can fly, religion and science. I think science can show you that, when properly interpreted and integrated, that indeed world order is a rational, meaningful, empirically demonstrable concept. And then point out, to try to reflect on, with you and perhaps with the feedback from you afterwards in the next few days, on the crucial elements which could accelerate this process. Those crucial spiritual, cultural, intellectual elements which could indeed bring about this progression from the present highly diverse but disunited world into a world that is diverse but united. So let me just say a few words on the trend toward higher levels of integration and unity in nature and in society. Let me just briefly run down, and as I said, if you are interested in any of these concepts, I can show you the graphs on it. I also happened to have published a few months ago a book which includes all of these graphs, plus some description, of course, in 300 pages, so, which is available. But the main concepts are these. We used to think, even at the beginning of this century, and certainly throughout the 19th century, that biological evolution somehow was inconsistent with the physical universe. The physical universe, as you know, at least in the 19th century conception, which is still powerful in the background of people's thinking today. The physical universe is conceived as a lifeless, mechanical domain that tends to use up energy, tends to use up its dynamism, its force, and eventually will settle down into this gray, formless, motionless condition, which is known as the heat death, or by physicists known as the state of maximum entropy. It's a condition from which no further changes can occur when all the free energies have been used up. So the physical universe has, if you like, an arrow of time. Which way does it proceed? It seems to proceed from a more dynamic state into a less dynamic state, from a more organized state into a more disorganized state. Ultimately chaos, ultimately just a blind mixing of matter in a cooling universe. This concept of the heat death of the universe, which seems to come from this famous second law of thermodynamics, has been challenged by the new cosmologies, has been challenged also by new developments in thermodynamics. I don't want to go into technical details at the present time, but certainly the concept of the universe as being purely a mechanical agglomeration of matter, which uses up its energies and dissipates into lower levels of organization, toward chaos, toward inertness. This conception has been surrendered. It's no longer held in the sciences, and we should no longer consider it in our everyday thinking. Instead, we are developing new concepts of the universe as being self-organizing, as being creative in an interesting sense, in the sense in which order, complexity, organization, or levels upon levels upon levels of systems, of complex entities seem to emerge in this universe, and they emerge sequentially from the physical to the biophysical, biochemical, biological, from there to the sociological, to the cultural, to the human sphere. Of course, the great trends of evolution do not go contrary, let me say right away, because we're in Princeton, and of course we want to make sure that we at least have got the basic science right. They are not contrary to the second law of thermodynamics, because entropy can only be reversed locally if it grows elsewhere in the universe. But this local reversal of entropy seems to be a process that can be now explained in the new so-called non-equilibrium thermodynamics. So that it is not inconsistent with our physical world picture to understand that out of this initial chaos, because in the beginning was chaos, as the Greeks have already said, and I think as it is in the consciousness of humanity altogether present. In the beginning of this tremendous Big Bang explosion of the origins of the universe, out of this chaotic state, gradually there is a distillation process of building particles and systems of particles and systems of particles, etc., until you get the universe very thinly populated, because the universe is enormous and its matter component is very small. The ratio between radiation and matter is 1 billion to 1, according to latest computations. But this matter component of the universe builds sequentially into these quarks, leptons, hadrons, all these odd elementary particles, which then can cohere into more stable particles, photons without rest mass, the other particles that have baryons with rest mass, and so on. Some of these build into atoms. The atoms become more and more complex as they build up in stars, in interstellar space. They can eventually form stable atoms in the neutral state. These, in turn, can cohere into molecules. And these molecules apparently are widespread in the universe. They are there in interstellar clouds. And when biological evolution takes off on Earth, it takes off from these already complex elements that have been created, synthesized in the vast reaches of the cosmos. So we're not dealing with a mechanical universe that somehow was kicked into motion by a prime mover, as Aristotle said, or as Newton had to presuppose. It's not a universe which was once set into motion, even like a clockwork, and then runs down. On the contrary, it's a universe that emerges out of chaos, develops its own orders, and these orders build up. And they build up to higher and higher levels of complexity, whereby the lower levels are organized more and more among themselves, so that molecules are built of atoms. Cells and crystals and all the other microsystems are often built of molecules. Multicellular species are built of cells, of the coordination of cells. And species themselves, or populations, consist of individuals coordinated in some way, not only among themselves, but with their environment. So we have these biological systems, ecological systems, and nature on Earth, and conceivably in a large number of other planets, which are capable of supporting life, would build toward these higher levels of organization. Because another important insight here is that if you believe that the laws of science, which are actually regularities in nature, are not varying from one place in the universe to another, but are universal laws, then we have no reason to assume that life is limited to Earth. Life, perhaps in very different forms, but this kind of process of building systems on systems, and higher and higher levels, and finding always the unity on a new level within the diversity that was there on the lower level. This process is likely to take place on possibly millions of other planets, because the universe is very vast. We have not been able to communicate with them. It's not at all sure that in other planetary environments, this level of evolution where conscious human beings emerge come about simultaneously at a time frame whereby we could communicate, because we have to be within a reasonable distance to communicate. The distances are enormous, as you know, in the universe. It's not at all sure that when they come about, this conscious civilizations comes about, the spirituality emerges, that it wishes to communicate, that it creates a technological civilization. So there could be many reasons that for our contemporary current lack of contact with extraterrestrial civilization. None of this would preclude our assumption that life is a universal phenomenon, which, given the proper environments, will emerge. Now, let's go back to Earth, after all. Here we live, and here is where we have to find the unity. I would like to add one further element to this picture. And namely, that's the element that as you move on Earth, and in fact, in nature in general, but it comes very much to our minds here on Earth, it's very evident here, as you move from level to level of these systems that are built as Chinese boxes, boxes within boxes, always building higher and higher, the process is by no means smooth and continuous. Here we run into a basic controversy within the biological theories that are based on Darwin, and some of the newer theories in biology, macroevolutionary theories that come from the work of Stephen Jay Gould, for example, and Niles Eldredge, and are known as the punctuated equilibria theories. These new theories, which are also consistent with the new concept of thermodynamics, show that systems will not evolve by piecemeal adjustment. Rather, that when you have a given level of organization attained in a system, and a system can be an ecology, can be a species, can be an individual, can be a set of molecules or atoms, whatever. These systems will persist in their environment as long as they maintain themselves in that environment, as long as they can replenish that energy, which is inevitably used up. Anytime you have an active system, it uses up energy. We know that. We have to eat to replenish energy. We have to breathe the air. Our cars need fuel. Our houses need, fuel and bricks, everything else to be kept up. Everything would run down if it was not replenished. But as long as a system can replenish these free energies, a system will maintain itself, basically unchanged, with little variations. Major changes come about in a rather sudden process, which has gotten the name, which has received the name, almost a very popular, almost cultish kind of a concept these days in university circles, the name of bifurcation. A bifurcation is a sudden switch, a sudden phase change between one type of state in a system and a new one. What happens basically is, highly simplified, but I think basically correct, that when a system interacting with its environment is no longer able to maintain itself, no longer able to replenish the energies that it's using and the information that it requires to coordinate these energies, then it enters a chaotic phase, a phase of randomness, indeterminacy, in which the laws that have regulated that system, that have kept it organized, seem to be suspended. It's a phase of transformation. And in these phases of transformation, there are choices opening up. New solutions, new avenues can be explored by that system. This we have seen from experiments in the laboratory, even with physical chemical systems. We see it in biology, in the processes of speciation and mutation, whereby, the old concept that mutations bring about tiny little changes in the organism and gradually it transforms into another species. These, I think, have been very seriously challenged, these ideas, and they're replaced by the notion that species, as possibly as human societies and human cultures, exist as long as they exist with little variation. And when they change radically. They move in a saltatory way toward a new regime, toward a new type of organization. It's very important because the history of our species is full of these sudden switching scenarios. Instead of a smooth curve, we have going on relatively level, then suddenly something new occurs, a revolution, a change comes about. The time scale is relative. Of course, in biology, one talks about for a new species to emerge, 50,000 years as being almost instantaneous, but the assumption was millions of years for species to emerge. In human society, you can talk about 5,000 years, 8,000 years for the Neolithic revolution to spread from the Levant into Europe, into the Middle East, and up into Asia. That's 5,000 to 8,000 years. It's almost instantaneous compared to the hundreds of thousands of years that went on before in the Paleolithic. And then, when you move on to modern times, you find that these switches, this sudden move, shifts over into a new state, are intensifying. The time scale is being compressed, so that now we can have revolutions, basically technologically based revolutions, that move us from one state, from one type of society, from one type of culture into another relatively fast, perhaps a matter of decades, perhaps a matter of years. We don't know, just to refer to the most recent events, what kind of changes in a society will occur, not only through technological inputs, but through changes in the economy. As we know, these large upheavals that we have had in the past few days in the U.S. economy augur probably longer-term changes, the outcome of which is not foreseeable at the present time. But we know it's very unlikely that we'll maintain the kind of system that we have had in the post-war period. In the world itself at large, this holds true as well. Let me then move on to the second part with this connection between the two parts of my presentation, namely the first one trying to give you this image of a world in evolution, in self-creative evolution, moving through discontinuities onto higher and higher levels of integration. And the second part, which says that here we are on the threshold of a discontinuity, and the threshold of a bifurcation. A threshold which I think in the Baha'i faith is described as the chaos, as the uncertainty associated with adolescence and moving toward maturity. This would be, in different words, the same concept as saying a bifurcation in which the system of nation states, the economy, the political system, the financial system, the cultures themselves that you have created in the 20th century and have seemed to have reinforced through these cataclysmic interventions of the two world wars, but have given it a tremendous impetus since the mid-century, for 25 years or so, that this system is coming now to an end, and we are in the process of transforming toward a new one. Now, as I mentioned, the transformations are always unpredictable and random in the sense that many different pathways open, many different possibilities exist as you move from one level to another. But statistically and on the whole, in nature, there are always some survivors. And the survivors are those who manage to meet the challenge. Those who manage to find the new level of integration, the new level of building systems, convergent systems on the next higher level. Because what does the higher level do? Let me just add this one final point. The higher level always coordinates and integrates the diversity on the lower levels. When you create a university, you are meant basically to integrate and coordinate the diversity that exists in the world of higher education, of learning. When you create a community, you're meant to coordinate and integrate the diversity that exists among the members of that community, among their interests, etc. So as you move on a higher level, you always simplify and integrate the process. Now, it seems to me that our present system of nation states, 180 or so nation states, which some 160 or thereabouts are members of the United Nations, which itself would try to coordinate, but as you know, there's tremendous difficulties due to the unwillingness, and primarily of the member states, coordinate this diversity. But that this enormous discrepancy between one kind of uncoordinated diversity and a coordinated diversity, this discrepancy, if it's to be successfully surmounted, would call for a move toward the next higher level above the nation state. And this higher level above the nation state could be first as an intermediary step, a regional coordination such as is attempted with so far not much but still some success in Europe. And there are other regional bodies in the world, in Southeast Asia and in Latin America, etc. But in very early embryonic stages of development. But ultimately this coordination would have to be done on the global level. And when we talk about world order, we talk about, in this perspective, about that next necessary level of coordination and integration that will give you the unity in this diversity that will enable humanity to survive. Without it, I think there is a very grave danger that the diversity could disintegrate and degenerate into violence. And we all know the possibilities of extinction that are attendant on violence. So if world order is an evolutionary imperative, not in the sense that it's fated, I don't think in evolution anything is fated in advance, but in the sense that if humanity is to evolve, it must find world unity. If it's not to kill itself, if it's not to degenerate in some way. If this, and this is a survival necessity, a survival imperative, then what are the factors that could move us onto this level, increase our chances that we achieve it, instead of going in the opposite, in the catastrophic direction? We have, in the Western world, which for better or for worse has inspired technologies which have spread worldwide, which have created the revolution of rising expectations, which have brought about the changes in worldviews. We have in the Western world inherited a worldview, a conception of the universe, which is based on the early and great pioneers of modern science, as they emancipated their thinking from medieval doctrines. The great transformation came about already in the thinking of Galileo. Again, not going into details, let me just indicate to you that in the Galilean conception, nature is subject to knowable laws, operating independently of the human will. And this was, he perceived this in several of his letters. He wrote that this removing the core problems of human change and human development from the realm of emotional discourse, of conflicts, of belief systems, and putting it on this under the solid, seemingly solid scientific basis, could be a recipe, could be a way of introducing reason and stability into the very turbulent environment in Europe in the 16th century and 17th century. But these laws were mechanistic. These laws conceived of the universe as basically, as Newton then subsequently formulated, as the concourse of individual mass points, like little billiard balls, interacting with each other, according to strict laws of causality. Galileo could integrate the heavens and the earth because he could show mountains on the moon with his telescope, and then Newton could show that the laws of gravitation which hold on Earth also hold in the celestial sphere. A very big change, because up till now in the Middle Ages it was held that all these laws hold only on Earth, and the celestial spheres operate under quite different conditions. So we have had a step forward in the integration of our conception of the universe, but it was a mechanistic step. We conceived of the universe as a giant mechanism. And this conception is the one that we have inherited and that underlines our thinking. underlies most of our technologies, except for the new information communication technologies, which no longer operate on this basis. They could not operate. You could still operate a hand crank calculator on the basis of the Galilean world concept. You can't operate a computer on that anymore. But our everyday way of thinking is still that kind of thinking. In that kind of thinking, in which the universe is the mechanism that runs down, where things are independent of one another. What happens when you transpose this thinking to society, to the world system around you? What you see on this traditional cognitive map, as scientists will always talk about cognitive maps as the map that we build of the world around us, on the basis of which we behave. On this cognitive map, we see individuals. The individual is the reality. The group is just something that individuals enter into because for their mutual interest, or they want to. The social contract theories of Rousseau, for example, were a direct outcome of this. There are no realities that we cannot perceive. There are no realities that we cannot touch. Matter and little particles of matter and the things that are built of these little particles of matter are basically the realities. And these, much as already Democritus have said 2,500 years ago, are fortuitous. These are more or less random mixing of these particles. Now, marvelous instruments, mechanical instruments, could be built in the 17th century and 18th century, pulleys and all kinds of things, on this conception. But this conception is not adequate anymore in the light of the contemporary sciences, and is not adequate to bring us forward from little princedoms, from little unities in which people seem to have congregated because they wished to congregate or they were born into it, toward a larger and larger human family in which there's complexity and diversity. Because where is the reality of world order? Where is the reality of a world system? Nowhere. In this conception that we inherited, everything is separable, so-called reductionist, reductionistically removable, movable down to the individual particle. The human body is but a complex mechanism consisting of cells, just like a society is a complex system reducible to the individual. But the individual and the cell are the reality, you see, and not what they form together. So if we operate on this basis, we will not perceive any reality beyond the individual, and perhaps we will somehow sneak in on the back door, as it were, the reality of a nation, particular nation state. Why? Because we are building symbols, so many symbols on the national level that seem to sort of permeate our thinking. Flags, all kinds of symbols of national unity, hymns and whatnot. So that you are somehow assuming that the world consists of individuals in nations, and anything else is nonsense, is illusion, is utopia. Now, this is I think, the cognitive map that we have inherited from the 16th century onwards, developed in Europe, but spreading to many parts of the world. I'm not now mentioning the concurrent religious traditions, obviously, which have flowered elsewhere also. But technology has been based on this cognitive map, and it is now has to undergo obviously transformation. Now, there are major challenges to this map, to this conception of the world. One of the challenges, of course, comes from interdependence. We are now beginning to see that if the stock exchange behaves in a catastrophic manner in New York, the Tokyo Stock Exchange will respond almost instantaneously. That if there is a dictator in the Persian Gulf is, putting mines down there, it can have repercussions in all the capitals of the world. Interdependence has become a key word and has become a perceived reality also. But purely interdependence alone is not enough, because so-called pragmatic, common sense statesmen, businessmen See, we'll always say that, well, interdependence is because of a complex set of relationships between the individuals, individual nations. So basically the way to deal with interdependence is still on the national level. And we see this in the UN, where national policy very often insists on bilateral ties, even in an interdependent environment. Instead of collective decision-making, you have the individual bilateral ties developing and going, leaving by the side the total community, which should be finding its unity, which should be developing, actually. Now, interdependence is a step in the right direction, but it's still mechanistic, it's still atomistic in its practical resolutions. There's another map, which is the ecological map. The green movements in Europe and in many parts of the world, which are now emerging as an alternative to traditional politics. I was very pleased to note that this morning I just heard that the Baha'i community is entering with the World Wildlife Fund into this new declaration and the program on the preservation of nature, the unity of nature, and as a basis for the unity of mankind. Now, this is already a different way of looking at the world, which is of great promise. Here, I think the main inspiration has been these famous Apollo pictures of the 1970s, where you see the Earth as being a seamless whole swimming in the vast expanse of space. And you don't see individual nations, you don't obviously see individuals in it. You don't see little points of matter moving about mechanistically. It's an integrated system. As we know, the weather is an integrated system. All the biochemical, ecological processes are worldwide, whether it's the ozone layer or cosmic ray influxes or, unfortunately, acid rain or anything else, or the spread of radioactive clouds. This cognitive map, if it's not limited to nature, but includes humanity, harbors very great promise. The tendency has been in past years to think of nature as being seamless and humanity being somehow still composed of these atomistic units that can fight with each other, and hopefully they don't destroy nature. But if you put humanity into it as being part of this seamless, integrated world system, then I think this map already is beginning to respond to the needs for creating a world order. This map joins forces, and let me just say a few words about that, joins forces with a conception with which I've been very closely associated and very closely involved, which the shortest way could be described as the systems view of the world, as a systems conception, whereby the world is conceived, as I have sketched earlier, conceived as a series of superimposed, integrated systems. None is more real or less real than another. You cannot say that a quark, even though we can't perceive it, and we probably can never perceive it, even in principle, that we cannot say that that's less real than an atom. We cannot say that an atom, even that we can't see except under electron microscopes, is less real than a molecule or a cell, up to the level of the organism. And above it, we cannot say on this new conception that a culture, that a community, take the Baha'i community, take Princeton University, whatever examples you want to take, that will be less real than the individuals that compose it. Because that is also a system, you see, on its own right. So we cannot, in this new conception, the ecological and the systems conception, we cannot say that the world consists of nations, sovereign, independent, ready and able to fight each other for their own benefit, not responsible to anybody else, to any higher authority, which was the principle of the sovereign nation state ever since the Peace of Westphalia. Now, on this new conception, obviously, the world is a possibly integrated unity. Let me just conclude with a few words on the importance of the integration or the joining of forces between this new conception as it emerges from the sciences and as it might come from the religions. Because we need a major force, we need a major mutation, if you like, in our cognitive maps, if we are to move from this crisis-prone, self-centered, backward-looking nation-state system toward a system of world order. This mutation, this bifurcation, this point, can be channeled into the positive, constructive, evolutionary directions if there is a major, to use again a term that's become popular from science, a major fluctuation, a major movement that has been small perhaps at its origin but is growing rapidly, which can take hold of people's thinking. Now, we know of many fluctuations of this kind, many ideas. We know the tremendous effect, whether we like it or not, agree with it or not, it doesn't matter at this point, but the tremendous effect of Marxism that it had in the early part of the 20th century and its mid-20th century. Transplanted by Lenin first to the Soviet Union, then by Mao to China. Even though its original form is all but lost, it's undergoing many quick mutations all the time. But these fluctuations could change the shape of humanity, of human systems. We need now a new fluctuation which must have the impact of the great religious insights joined with the scientific insights. Because not enough if scientists join forces and say, well, we perceive the world like this, if humanity at large thinks in entirely different terms, because in the contemporary political reality, it's the larger masses of mankind, of a population that will always sway public opinion, will sway the decision-making process. So the input of religion is very important. It was the role of all the great religions to promote and to perceive a unity in its diversity, a community peaceful community of people. There are many secular and divisive elements, obviously, in the traditional great religions, but there's also this one. And I think, even though I speak to you who are much more at home in that, I speak to you as one who is a friend of and admirer of the Baha'i faith, but not as familiar with it as you are. I think here I see the tremendous potential of the Baha'i teachings in reinforcing this conception, this systems conception, this evolutionary conception, as being that necessary movement which could trigger those social and cultural changes which will be required to move us not to war and degeneration and selfish infighting of these outdated cognitive maps, but moving toward this higher level of integration, the higher level of finding a unity in diversity. I'm well aware that the founder of the faith, of Baha'u'llah, has said that religion is a major force in the world. That through religion we could find this unity. I couldn't agree anymore. I couldn't agree also anymore with the concept that religion and science has to join forces. I would only say that you have to be very careful in choosing still the currents in the contemporary sciences, the currents that are not entrenched specialists, because that exists also, that do not deny or reject responsibility for humanity, for scientific discoveries. But the currents that look at the world with a broad perspective and try to find those elements in this very rapid development in the sciences that could join together with the basic insights of the Baha'i faith and create a movement toward a world order that could indeed bring about a unity in our world of diversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here, and well, like all of you, I am deeply interested in the subject that has brought us together this weekend. Both as a Baha'i and as a student of history, I am greatly encouraged by the conviction underlying a conference of this kind that we are moving into an era where the two great traditions that have so long followed divergent courses and conflicting courses in the past 400 years or so of Western history now may show signs of convergence. But I suspect that I speak for many others here in the room when I say that I approach the subject with some unease and perhaps even some reluctance. Humanity's consistent experience over this period that I've been speaking of, these 4 centuries or so, has left very deep impressions in the form of assumptions and inhibitions that will not quickly dissipate. It may be well at the outset of our conference if we look frankly at the context in which all such exploration is going to have to proceed, particularly as the discussion moves outside the still limited confines of groups like our own. Apart from any other differences between them, the two realities, and I think Dr. Laszlo has been very helpful in asking us to look at the approaches to reality these traditions represent. These two approaches, whose possible convergence we are considering here, do not come to the meeting as equal partners. Science is born here on an ever-expanding tidal wave of success. I admit I am a layman, the quintessential layman in this field, but I am also one of the uncounted millions of beneficiaries of scientific advantage and of scientific progress, and I think this experience therefore has some validity. And when I say that, science comes here as the benefactor of mankind. Unevenly, the benefits are distributed. Millions of people have been freed from the most soul-destroying labor and have been given the opportunity to explore their own natures. The arts and music have been brought into, access has been given to them through all kinds of inventions created, brilliant inventions created by science. It's very true that science produces weapons of war and diversions that degrade, but the responsibility for this can hardly be laid at the door of science. The scientific tradition, perhaps the finest fruit of Western civilization, has won not merely unstinted respect and gratitude from its uncounted beneficiaries, but an understandable awe and bordering, unfortunately at times, even on idolatry. The record of religion during this same period under consideration could not present a starker contrast. It is not to deprecate by any means the work of many thousands of self-sacrificing individuals if we recognize candidly that this record has been not merely dismal but distressingly dark. Perhaps I don't want to belabor the point, but it may be helpful, particularly in a discussion like this, if we remind ourselves that historians tell us that Europe's wars of religion in the 16th century were perhaps the most destructive in human history in terms of human life and property, and poisonous of the very streambed of Western culture. Who would deny that the modern substitute faiths that have appeared in our own era owe this immense self-righteousness, this conviction of their own rightness and their right to impose their dogmas on others, to the attitudes that were carefully inculcated through generations of theological preachment. In whatever has concerned the life of the mind, the role of organized religion has been to reinforce obscurantism. Where religious institutions have adjusted themselves to and taken part in progressive movements, the motivation has all too frequently and all too obviously been a recognition of sheer necessity. Even in the field of service to mankind, who would suggest that the fruits of religious charity can in any way match the undiscriminating benefits poured out by social agencies of entirely secular society, many of whose personnel can match in dedication the dedication exhibited by the servants of ecclesiastical organizations. However reluctant some segments of society understandably still are to put the assessment into words, religion has not unfairly been judged by contemporary standards as irrelevant to the progress of humanity, if not actually harmful to it. Well, what can two such traditions say? What do they have to say to one another? How can two such approaches to reality converge? Perhaps more helpfully, why do we here take up such a question? Why do we believe, as we clearly do, that the issue will be of increasing interest to our contemporaries? I think we do so because we feel we must. We see the situation of mankind in the closing decades of the 20th century demanding it. We see humanity today trapped in a malaise that is producing social paralysis and threatens the very future of organized society. A civilization that is capable of endowing every human being on earth with at least the elements of happiness, a wholesome life, well-being, finds itself increasingly incapable of maintaining even those benefits that have so far been achieved. I don't have to expatiate on the subject of public discussion in our age. Increasingly, we are bereft of the motivation to act as our most elementary self-interest dictates. And we lack the energy to sustain even such limited resolutions as do fitfully emerge. A parallel and totally unanticipated development turns our problem into an exquisitely painful dilemma. As the spreading enemy of our age impels us ever more urgently to seek new sources of empowerment, we find ourselves bewildered spectators at an outpouring of apparently unlimited moral energy, the worldwide phenomenon of religious revival. Suddenly, masses of our fellow human beings are caught up in a spiritual revival that creates motivation for sweeping social changes and generates apparently limitless capacity to sustain them. Self-interest is just swept aside. Prosperity, social norms, family, even life itself are not too high sacrifices to pay for the visions that sustain and apparently have tapped these hidden reservoirs. Far from being limited to any one nation or another, the rising tide presses against the orderly assumptions of virtually every society on earth. And there is no reason to believe that we are at the end. We are probably at the very early stages of this phenomenon. But it is the kraken that has waked. Blind, profoundly ignorant, destructive and unashamedly self-righteous, the universal religious revival of our time threatens to sweep away the moral and intellectual fruits of years, of centuries of patient effort. Yet there appears to be no other significant source of moral vitality currently accessible to mankind. As such, religious fundamentalism, as it's commonly called, exerts immense fascination on the chancelleries, the universities, the boardrooms of Western civilization. They speculate on how such energy can be harnessed to serve the mundane occasions of materialistic civilization. What alliances can be made? What accommodations reached? Mere terrorism, economic ruin, the suppression of minorities, the abuse of women are not too high prices to pay or any barrier to the earnest campaign to penetrate the secret. What on the surface might otherwise appear to be intellectual nonsense is given sedulous and respectful consideration. The most discouraging experiences are not enough to kill the suspicion that somewhere in this bewildering and largely repellent phenomenon may exist a key to mankind's future. The possibility derives great encouragement from the experiences of the formative ages in the history of civilization. The great cultural breakthroughs associated with Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam especially come particularly to mind. History presents us with numerous and impressive examples of the capacity of the religious spirit to enrich humanity, to bring unity to divergent races and cultures, to discipline man's animal instincts, and to create vast new plateaus on which a new life can be erected. In the degree that present-day civilization still observe, or societies still observe, the dictates of ethical principles, we can detect vestigial remnants of this earlier spiritual breakthrough in each society. So we ask ourselves, can this happen in our own age? Will the folly sort of burn itself out and some underlying sanity emerge? Can the vast reservoirs of moral energy that pour mindlessly through the fundamentalist fissures that have opened in our age be channeled into the task of achieving global unity and peace? Well, Baha'is, of course, believe confidently that they can, and we advance the experience of our own community as an evidence supporting this conviction. Before I attempt to describe a model that has slowly taken shape during a century and a half of effort, let me first establish its religious credentials. However rational its discourse, however gratifying the reputation it has won in the media, favorite terms are gentle and peace-loving, however orderly and democratic the administrative processes by which it organizes its life may be, the Baha'i community is essentially a religious movement dedicated to a revolutionary restructuring of human society and of human consciousness. It displays the two essential features of the worldwide religious revival we have been discussing: the capacity to create motivation for fundamental change and the energy to sustain and infinitely expand these transformations. This expansion has enrolled peoples of every conceivable race, nation, class, culture, religious background, and linguistic grouping, including hundreds of indigenous tribes. Now, the energy needed to accomplish this feat can in no wise be compared with the kind of effort by which religious movements traditionally grow. It represents not an arithmetic increase in the number of members of congregations, nor in the number of congregations themselves, but a rapidly accelerating multiplication of organized groups, a multiplication that is in no way restrained by barriers of language, belief, culture, or geography. The magnitude of the achievement can be appreciated from the fact that in only a few decades, a community now numbering perhaps 4.5 million people is at work in over 20,000 centers in virtually every part of the world, has succeeded in bringing into existence locally elected governing bodies to direct its activities, and represents in most of these settings an essentially indigenous phenomenon. Such growth has been possible only because many thousands of individual Baha'is have been seized up by the conviction that they should set aside personal interests and risk careers, family needs, prosperity, health, sometimes even life itself, so as to establish themselves in a new area where they could become the nucleus of a new center for the cause in which they believe. Even more demanding in many cases has been the task of sustaining this drive in the face often of great privation until the process is complete. While many such projects entail settlement in smaller or more remote areas of the individual's own homeland, a large percentage have carried Baha'i pioneers, as they're called, to far distant lands. Let me emphasize that those who have served this vast expansion are not a clerical caste employed in those functions and supported by missionary facilities and establishments, but are ordinary men and women who have chosen to make their lives and their livelihood in new and often difficult regions of the globe because of the central tenet of their faith that the earth is one country. I know of no comparable phenomenon on the contemporary scene, and for reasons that have already been alluded to, I feel no obligation to accept Marxism from my comment. As this rapid growth was taking place, an even more significant and far-reaching attitudinal change was slowly occurring among the community's heterogeneous membership. Concepts that had been the fruit of decades of painstaking research in the social sciences and humanities, and that have represented until recently primarily the views advanced in academic symposia and scholarly journals, have made their appearance as the distinguishing religious convictions of the rank-and-file members of a global community, many of them with little education and a considerable percentage of them entirely illiterate. The equality of men and women, the desirability of intermarriage among peoples of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, the equal validity of all the great belief systems of the past, the moral imperative for a limitation on extremes of wealth and poverty, even the conviction that national sovereignty must be sacrificed to the idea of world government. These have, to the extent that external circumstances permit, begun to mold the character of the Baha'i community life and of the behavior of its individual members. The community early saw itself as entrusted by God with the task of raising successive generations of world-minded children, a task whose success seems assured by the confirmations both of providence and the direction of the development of civilization. As the process advances, the effect of these attitudinal changes is cumulative. Just as the followers of religious fanaticism find in the opposition they arouse confirmation of the fact that their opponents are satanic and they themselves are right, so Baha'is the world over see their convictions about the course of human history immeasurably reinforced by the insights into human nature that they encounter among scholars and developing peoples whom they meet in their projects alike. One can say with some degree of assurance that, in a manner of speaking, the convergence we are discussing here this weekend has taken place in the minds of the rank-and-file members of the Baha'i faith, since for them there is no fundamental point of conflict between religion and science. On the other hand, the mysteries of the spiritual world, which in past dispensations have been sort of chasse gardée of an ecclesiastical elite, are now laid open to the examination of the scientific method in the same fashion as all the other phenomena of existence. They do not represent assertions about the phenomenal world that contradict science and reason. In discussing the Baha'i faith, therefore, we are speaking about a religion, about a phenomenon which has its source in what its followers believe is an intervention of the divine in our age. I think it's a point that I ought to perhaps emphasize. It has unfolded through a history of heroes and martyrs. Its international life is focused on shrines that attract streams of pilgrims from all parts of the globe the year round. The decisions by which its millions of members determine the personal issues in their lives are taken through a process of prayer and meditation. It has laws governing the important concerns of life, which are obeyed not merely because they are reasonable, however reasonable they may appear, or however much experience may confirm them, but because they are the laws of God. It calls on the individual to submit his will to the decisions of the majority and to place the welfare of the community above his own. It challenges some of present-day society's most cherished assumptions about the nature of the human being, of society, of history, of the future. Its followers the world over, whether scholars or laymen, are characterized by a profound devotion for the founder of the faith, who, while in no way an incarnation of an unknowable and unimaginable deity, nevertheless is the channel for God's revelation on earth and the manifestation of His attributes. The Baha'i faith is, in short, a religion in the fullest sense of the term and in the full exercise of the genius and the creative power that throughout recorded history have been associated with the religious impulse in civilization. If we had any doubts of its credentials as a revolutionary spiritual movement whose progress will not easily be checked or diverted by any forces known to us, the history of the past 8 years should relieve them. In Iran, all the agencies of an entirely ruthless and immensely self-confident totalitarian regime, backed by the wholehearted support of fanatical masses, has been totally unable to suppress a community that represents less than 1% of the entire population. On the contrary, the all too public effort to compel Baha'is to abandon their faith for reasons that seem incomprehensible to many people has enormously reinforced the victims, accelerated the spread of their message throughout the rest of the world, consolidated the influence of their religion, and provided their co-religionists elsewhere with confirmation of the validity of their own beliefs. The adage that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of faith has never probably been more dramatically vindicated. What has not escaped those who have been the closest observers of the situation, I'm speaking of the people of Iran, is the fact that this contest has taken place not between a religious movement and a political regime whose authority ultimately rests on material means of enforcement, but between two revolutionary spiritual movements who differ not in the intensity of their conviction that they are fulfilling the divine will, but in their understanding of the nature of that will. Iran is important to Baha'is because it provides a preview, if you like, of the period of intense testing that Baha'u'llah asserted his faith will traverse in pursuit of its mission to serve the cause of global peace and, obviously, the assurance of its eventual triumph. The Baha'i faith is an entirely separate religious system, just as Christianity, these are his words, just as Christianity and Islam are separate religious systems. It is not a branch of one of the earlier traditions. The significance of the point can perhaps best be appreciated when one looks at it against the background of some of its contemporaries among 19th century religious developments. While movements within Christianity, such as the Mormon Church, or within Islam, such as the Ahmadiyya movement, also saw themselves as having mandates with universal application, based themselves indeed on the work of founders who were seen as prophets, it is clear that they have, in each case, remained a sect of the parent tradition. The Vedanta society in Hinduism may perhaps be another example. However impressive their numerical growth was, at earlier stages at least, in their development, and however beneficial much of their influence may be, they have not escaped the gravitational pull, so to speak, of the cultural matrix that produced them. The Baha'i faith, on the other hand, long ago freed itself entirely from its Islamic and Iranian background, relying solely on the teachings conveyed to them through the Bab and Baha'u'llah. There has not, to my knowledge, been a similar phenomenon since the rise of Islam in the 6th century. And I don't in any way accept from that the Sikh religion, which, if anything, I suppose, perhaps was not so restrained theologically, but the restraints, the cultural and national restraints, have been, if anything, even more constricting. What then does this youngest of the world's independent religions bring to the crisis that now engulfs humankind? On the basis of its interpretation of the human condition, it also advances a prescription. The well-being of mankind, Baha'u'llah asserts, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. And one of his successors, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, Shoghi Effendi, said the whole of mankind is groaning, is dying to be led to unity. If the Baha'i contribution to the current discussion, particularly at university, were limited to a message and a prescription, however persuasive they might seem, to significant segments of public opinion, Baha'is would hardly venture to take up the time of a gathering of this nature. Theories of history and theoretical models abound, and there are scholars far better trained than we to assure that they receive appropriately careful consideration. And there is certainly no reason to believe that, given the record of religion that I have already made reference to, there would be any widespread public interest in the thought that religious theory presented the way out of our dilemma. What Baha'is bring to a discussion of this nature, rather, is an experience. What we urge be given serious examination by those concerned about humanity's future is the global community that has slowly taken shape around the world as the result of more than a century of effort on the part of Baha'u'llah, his immediate successors, and the body of those who have sought to put their teachings into effect. We seek to draw attention to the fact that there now exists a promising operating model for the struggle toward a unified global society, a model brought into existence through the efforts of a religion. Far from seeing itself as already complete or self-sufficient, the community that has emerged from this process is embarked on an infinite series of experiments at the local, national, and international levels to realize the vision of mankind's oneness which it finds in the writings of its founder. In this undertaking, all peoples of goodwill are free to participate. Obviously, time does not permit me to trace in any detail the historical process, perhaps at all, that has brought this community into existence, nor even the specifics of its social and administrative life. I refer you to the rapidly growing body of literature on this subject. What is important for the purposes of our discussion this weekend is to identify some of the principal features of the model which recommend it to serious study. One of the primary goals of the Baha'i community is to help mankind to bring about the unification of the human race. In the eyes of a highly skeptical age, therefore, the faith's most interesting, I should say the community's most interesting credential is the fact that it has passed safely through the first critical century of its history with its unity firmly intact. Alone, this achievement distinguishes it among the religions of the world. Alone, this achievement distinguishes it among the religions of the world. As there is no other significant religious, or I suppose one could safely say political, movement, form of association of which the same could be said. Time and again, in all forms of religious association, the process of schism has taken hold in the early, most vulnerable stages, and the originating impulse has had to continue its work through the efforts of often contending sects and factions. In attracting this diversity, the process of assimilation has not occurred at the expense of the cultural and spiritual origins of those who have entered it. Baha'i communities in Norway and Jamaica or India and Peru, while united in the organizing principles of their life, present dramatic contrasts in the way in which they attempt to realize Baha'u'llah's vision. If we are to take our fellow human beings at their word, those who have entered the community from Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Sikh, Zoroastrian, animist, whatever background, believe that they have done so with their original faith fully intact. It is a fact established now through a century of experience that a worldwide community can revere the founders of all the great revealed religions equally, can find in racial and cultural diversity sources of pleasure and creativity and strength, can so organize its affairs that women and men share equally in the decision-making responsibility without sacrifice of the special capacities that history has and culture have developed in each. Thirdly, a feature of the model to which I've already made passing reference is its success in remolding human conscience, in establishing a set of universal moral standards relevant to the age of mankind's maturity. Solely out of devotion to the founder of the Baha'i faith, ordinary people in every part of the world have surrendered themselves to a process of education in ideals that can only be described as highly advanced. My point is that for Baha'is these principles are not chiefly matters of sociological theory, but integral parts of a psychological pattern and emotional life in which generations of human beings one generation after another, are being patiently and deliberately raised. The Baha'i faith possesses its own universal history. As I have indicated, it has its noble army of martyrs, several thousands of them. Today, a generation of Japanese, Italian, Bolivian, Canadian, Icelandic, what have you, children are being educated in this common tradition. They have been given a priceless advantage, in my opinion, as a student of history, a common past. Such a history easily assimilates to itself the essential features of the national and cultural experiences of earlier eras and constitutes a past far more intimate and accessible than were the histories of conflict that once divided their parents. Finally, the social model brought into existence by the work of Baha'u'llah is endowed with a feature that is particularly challenging to all who would consider seriously its role in the years immediately ahead. Challenging, and for that matter, in any respect. In what he terms a covenant with the body of his followers, a covenant established through the work of his son and appointed successor, Baha'u'llah resolved the age-old question of authority in human affairs in a manner unique in human history, in religious history. For the first time, it is the body of believers themselves, the people, who have been entrusted with the revelation of God and with its application to human affairs. The emergence of an ecclesiastical elite under whatever guise has been effectively and permanently prevented. Baha'is are called on to elect through democratic processes of secret ballot and plurality vote, in which all forms of electioneering are prohibited, bodies of 9 persons at the local, national, and international levels, in whom the decision-making power of the community is vested for periods of time established in the scriptures of the faith. The consultative principles that govern the operation of these institutions are themselves explicitly laid down in the writings of the founder. Thus, a common system of decision-making guides the work of the 30,000 local spiritual assemblies around the globe and the 148 national spiritual assemblies. Because the system also includes monthly events of both devotional and administrative in nature, of which discussion of local concern among all the members of the community is an integral part, every Baha'i in the world is to one degree or another a student of the consultative process. He or she participates as well in the series of elections at local, district, national, and international levels through which the collective leadership, including the membership of the governing body of the Baha'i world, the House of Justice, is chosen. The advantages of such a feature of the model are not difficult to appreciate. One of the most interesting certainly lies in the field of social and economic development. For several decades, from 1937 onwards, the Baha'i community has devoted its development efforts primarily to the task of training its members at the local level in the demanding work of decision-making, group problem-solving. Concentration on the onerous and difficult tasks imposed by this program has not been easy, particularly not in the 2 or 3 decades after World War II, when many other agencies believed that the key to social and economic development in the Third World lay primarily in the infusion of funding, technology, and guidance from developed societies. Today, of course, that received wisdom has lost much, if not all, its force. As professional opinion has come to recognize the essentially grassroots nature of successful development, Baha'is see the fruition of decades of tedious effort. I can't tell you how tedious. In the efflorescence of thousands of elected decision-making bodies capable of providing ever more effective leadership at the village level. Throughout the world, we find Baha'i spiritual assemblies, as they are called, emerging as focal centers for problem solving. The effectiveness of the system is greatly increased by the fact that it is global in scope, thus permitting both human and material resources to be directed to areas of greatest promise, while leaving the decision-making authority in the hands of those familiar with the local situation, which is virtually the reverse of what has often occurred in the past. I use the word authority advisedly, nervously but advisedly. Baha'u'llah enjoins upon his followers to accept decisions made by majority vote once the consultative process has occurred. There is no loyal opposition, to use a Canadian term, in Baha'i community life. The spiritual assemblies are called upon constantly to review their decisions and to be prepared to reassess them in the light of new information or new developments. But they have the right to expect the support of those who elect them. They have the right to be wrong and still to be obeyed. The direction that Baha'u'llah has taken on the vexed central question of authority is at once one of the most compelling and most challenging features of the social model his teachings have brought into existence. Authority is, of course, the great conundrum of human history. It is an issue that generates the most intense anxiety precisely because it is an issue that we have never been able to evade. What Baha'u'llah has done essentially is confer on the entire body of his followers the right to make the decisions that determine, in the light of general principles, the direction of the community's affairs, and to charge them with the responsibility of accepting those decisions once they have been made. This is preeminently true of the decisions of the Universal House of Justice, the governing body chosen by all the followers of Baha'u'llah throughout the world. The election of the initial membership of this institution in 1963 may well represent the first truly democratic global election in human history. That's a subject for research of some Baha'i graduate student I think would be a very interesting subject to pursue. For the first time, a community representative of a significant portion of the human family was able to bring into existence by common consent an agency through which it can pursue its common mission. This is, in my opinion, by far the most intriguing single feature of the model we are discussing. It encourages us to believe that the human race as a whole may in time find a way to act decisively, intelligently, humanely, in concert. If humanity is, in the marvelous words of Julian Huxley, evolution become conscious of itself, this consciousness needs urgently those central organs through which it can function in accordance with the enormous tasks that lie ahead of it. In no other area of its achievement is the model created by Baha'u'llah more encouraging. In what has been said, I have sought to describe for you, however inadequately, some of the distinguishing features of the model for social change that has come into existence through the work of the Baha'i faith. Unity of thought and action. Universality of scope and the success it has enjoyed in assimilating into its life all that can fairly be called human. A new system of values that seems effectively to relate its efforts to the challenging demands of an evolving race. A common past more real than any of the divisive experiences that formed its component parts. And a pattern of collective decision-making endowed with a measure of authority that fits it to accomplish tasks that would otherwise be far beyond its still limited resources. What I have attempted to outline has been summed up by the guardian of the faith, who described the Baha'i community in a phrase that I think is pregnant, as conscious of the society-building power inherent in the mission of Baha'u'llah. It is this building process, he added, slow and unobtrusive, to which the life of the community is wholly consecrated. In the Baha'i faith, we have, in short, a world religion which sees its primary responsibility precisely as helping to build a global society fit for human beings to live in. Its primary responsibility. Such a conscious purpose was never before a realistic possibility for the religious impulse. At best, the improvement of social conditions was a byproduct of absorption in the transcendent. Always ahead lay the race's dimly perceived and largely misunderstood coming of age when the world would at last be redeemed. The message of Baha'u'llah is that this day has arrived. The painful but inexorable emergence on the world scene of the model he conceived, the emergence of what Shoghi Effendi, guardian of the faith, termed a nucleus and pattern for world order, provides a measure of evidence for the truth of this assertion that should command the most careful attention we can give it. If we are interested in phenomena, if we are seriously interested in phenomena rather than a priori assumptions, we should surely examine a phenomenon of this nature. It is encouraging indeed for Baha'is in the midst of our struggles to perfect a community whose inadequacies and lapses are all too apparent to us, that scholars as distinguished as our dear friend Ervin Laszlo and our other speakers this weekend find in our efforts confirmations that advance the work they are doing on the frontiers of social research. And I hope I have not overstated the community I have described to you. It is a community that very much is in the process of formation, suffers setbacks and experiences advances daily. I need not reiterate here the place of precedence that scholarship enjoys in Baha'u'llah's writings. Reason, he says, simply constitutes God's greatest gift to humankind. We sense that this great enterprise of ours is poised on the threshold of a new advance that will equip it to play a far more effective role in the common effort to achieve a peaceful world. And we are more grateful than we can say that at this critical stage in our work, we have well-wishers and collaborators of the caliber of those who are with us this weekend. Collaborators whose independence of method and independence of motivation makes their assistance most creative. God, the Bab declared, sets all things free from one another, that they may be sustained by Him alone.